All right. Thank you, everybody. Welcome to the kickoff of the 2025 Energy Summer School that is being organized by the volunteer group Utah Needs Clean Energy uh, in support by me. I am Luis, and I am a senior campaign organizer with the Bianco campaign here in Utah. And we're really excited to have you join us from home or wherever you are watching this video. This summer school effort and series is the product of months of organizing by volunteers from Utah Needs Clean Energy and with the support of the Utah Sierra Club. So we'd like to take a moment to recognize those volunteers and staff that are making this happen. So this include Elisa Chamberlain, Natalie Glitz, Chris Sturchy, Jonan Twistle, Maya Hernandez, Stan Holmes, Emma Burham, and then there's me, Luis. And we have organized the summer school because we are passionate about clean energy and protecting our precious places. Our mission with this summer school is to teach and equip members of the public just like you to advocate effectively for a just, clean energy transition. And this is how we'll accomplish this mission. Uh, Today, we're going to start the ground running, talking about how the grid works and utilities profit to understand the basics of electricity, how it's generated, delivered, and how utilities earn profit. Then next month, on August 21st, we will go over who pays for what and why for electricity, where we will discover how rates are determined, who benefits, who pay more, and why it matters. On September 18, we will talk about solar storage and strain, clean energy meets the grid, and we will explore then the opportunities and challenges of integrating solar power, batteries, and electric vehicles into our grid. Then the big month of October, we will have one more session on Thursday, October 16, on the Public Service Commission. And this will be to prepare you to engage with Rocky Mountain Power's integrated resource plan and make your voice heard in regulatory spaces. This is because your final exam will be on Wednesday, October 29, when you put what you've learned into practice and voice how you feel in front of the Public Service Commission. In November, we're just going to host a little graduation party where you'll get a nice diploma or certificate for your completion of the program. So uh, after this, in the original session, I asked people what they were most excited about. And clearly, the September 18 class, Clean Energy Meets the Grid, is the one that has garnered a lot of excitement, understandably so. But the hope here is that the class that we're having that we had in July 17 and also on August 21st can help make that class a lot more meaningful to really understand the challenges and opportunities posed by clean energy. So today, it's going to be about how the grid works and how utilities profit. And so we'll get started by talking about the utility grid. We'll touch on some basic units of measurement. Then we'll talk about AC/DC and electricity generation. We'll go over a layout of the grid. We'll touch base on this thing we call the lake analogy. And we're going to finish this section by talking about resource dispatching. Then we'll talk about something you don't need to understand right away, but it is called revenue requirement. So we'll discuss how utilities get regulated when charging ratepayers, and then we'll go over what are the things that they're allowed to charge us for. And lastly, why revenue requirement matters. How does that sound? Okay. And so first, we'll get started talking about the grid. And the big question we want to answer in this section is, what is the electrical grid and how does it deliver power to our homes in real time? I must say that the grid is one of the most fantastical inventions or innovations over the past century. The way in which we're able to flip on a switch and for the lights to come on just feels like a miracle. And there's a lot happening to make that a possibility. Let's start from the basics by asking what is electricity, or at least how can we talk about it or measure it? I would think of electricity as something related to magnetism and charges and flow. In fact, I would invite you to think of it a bit like water flowing through a hose. Power is the amount of electricity or electric energy present at any moment in time. In other words, the amount of water there is in a given moment, we will usually measure in watts. Current is the rate flow of electrons in a wire. In this case, it is the speed at which water would be flowing through the hose, like the one we have here hypothetically. We will usually measure this in amps. That is the rate of flow. Voltage is the difference in pressure between two ends of a wire. In this case, it is essentially how much pressure there would be if you were to like pinch a hose of water without changing how much water is flowing through the hose. You know how it's usually going to come out a lot stronger, even though it might be the same or even less. But we usually call this in electricity like volts, that pressure of the water. And resistance is the friction that electrons encounter in a wire. In the case of a hose, the friction would be posed by the interior walls of a hose. So we will measure this in ohms. The most important one of these for now will be watts. And you hear us talk about watts as the actual amount of electricity being made or used. So if you were to go outside to your meter, it will likely have watts on its reading. We will often use kilowatt, which is 1,000 watts, as the typical residential customers would have about maybe 3 to 6 kilowatts demand. The instantaneous demand or draw in a system is often referred to as the load. You hear us talk about kilowatt hours or megawatt hours, which serves as a unit of electrical energy, representing the duration of a kilowatt over time. And this led us to asking this question to the rest of the room. Which room heater would use more electricity to heat a room? On one side, heater A, which uses 1,000 watts for 2 hours, or heater B, which is using 500 watts for 4 hours. This is just meant to be a hypothetical mathematical example to drive the point that they would use the same amount of electricity because we're considering kilowatt hours as that division of the watts divided by the number of hours. And so that would be about 500 kilowatt hours per hour. So hopefully that makes sense there. Now, this leads us to talk about AC/DC, by which I mean the currents and not the rock band. Most electric generation will come from some kind of turbine with magnets attached to it, spinning around coils of copper wires. And as that rotor rotates with the magnets in it, it's alternating charges on its head. Electrical charges then are pushed through the electrical wire. Think of it like almost like you're squeezing toothpaste or a substance through a hose, right? It's kind of doing that as it's moving and it's attracting that electrical charge to go through the copper wire. So this kind of current we would call alternating current or AC. The graph on the left represents how magnetism changes from positive to negative, like a wave, as you can see on the AC side. Most of our electricity comes from turbine-like power generators, and as such is what you will have on the grid, what you will usually see on the grid. In the United States, our AC current flows at 60 kilohertz, and it must never be higher or lower than that, otherwise things go wrong and outages may begin. Below, it is a graph that says DC, or direct current. If you notice on that one, it's a different kind of current. There's no turbine involved. There's just a constant flow of electrons. This kind of current will matter later on when we talk about how connecting solar panels and battery storage to the grid would impact the kinds of equipment needed to deliver and use that electricity. Because if what the lines have is AC and suddenly you connect something that is just constant, that is going to throw off, of course, the hertz in the line. So hopefully that makes sense. And also hopefully you're noticing you're learning a lot of things, and isn't that awesome? So question then is, how does electricity make it from where it's made to where it's needed? But before going to that point, we asked the class, which of the following best describes the difference between direct current and alternating current? DC flows in one direction, while AC changes direction periodically in terms of the flow of the charge. So let's talk about the grid then. This is where it comes in. The first component of the grid, as you can see all the way to the left side, is generation. Our electricity is usually generated at some kind of power plant facility. So this could be coal, gas, nuclear, hydro, geothermal, or even like utility scale solar and wind. You can replace the start of this diagram where it says generation with any power source of your choice. It just has a power plant there as an example, as a placeholder. But from the power plant, the electricity that comes from it then needs to go into the transmission portion of the grid to start getting to customers. And first, you need a transformer, which is a physical piece of equipment, to step up the voltage for transmission. What happens is that low voltage or pressure through electrical wires usually means electricity gets lost at a higher rate on its way. So by stepping up the voltage or pressure, it reduces line loss for long distances. So think again about that pinching of like that hose, but you still have the same amount of electricity going. It's going to increase the voltage on those transmission lines. And you would know the transmission lines because if you ever drive to like I-15, you can see this massive like towers with long cables carrying electricity long distances, right? Once the electricity is reaching customers, then we enter what we call distribution. Now, transmission lines usually connect to a step-down transformer. So not stepping them up, but now stepping it down to reduce the voltage so you can distribute it around your neighborhood without frying the equipment. If you see light poles around your street, those are likely distribution lines. So, and some of those light poles will also have this kind of big cylinder-like structures up top by the wires. You know what I mean? Like those cylinder things by the top of those electrical posts. This is another transformer that further steps down the voltage before it enters your house. At the end of the grid are the users or the customers. We call this demand or load. And that will matter later on. I will note that some industrial users will skip the distribution lines altogether because their machinery uses high voltage equipment. And so if some industrial users are skipping the distribution lines, do they also have a responsibility to carry the cost of those distribution lines, right? So that will impact cost of operation and maintenance of that by skipping them and connecting directly to the transmission lines. This is just to complexify that not always you may have distribution lines, but likely you'll have transmission lines as long as the power plant and the user are not in the same location. Now, electricity flowing from generation to transmission to distribution all the way to demand or load is what we call the grid. Sounds simple, right? So we asked the class, blank lines carry electricity long distances, and blank lines carry electricity to houses. And indeed, most people were correct. Transmission lines carry electricity long distances, and distribution line carry electricity to houses. So what's the catch, though? The catch is that all electricity must be used the instant it is generated, period. Oops. That means that what is being generated or put into the grid at any given instant must be equal to what is being used. The amount of electricity being made and used must always be perfectly balanced. And this is where maybe the lake analogy may not work as well. But if you were to close your faucet at home and stop using the water, or use a gate at a reservoir to stop the flow, the water left on the pipes can still be used, right? That's how we work with like water utilities. The water doesn't disappear. But if too much energy is being generated, or maybe if the demand for the electricity collapses, then the physical switches will flip on to stop the infrastructure from frying up. It is the same if too little electricity is being generated or too much energy is being used. or just when it is not perfectly balanced, things will go wrong, and they will go wrong very quickly. And this is what starts what we know as outages. I'm sure you're familiar with those. So this lake analogy helps us understand that for the lake to exist at the same level, it must always bring the same amount of water as the water that is being consumed. It must always be that way. So when does the utility know when to use what? Um, and before talking about that, I did add a tricky question for the participants of the first class, which is at what frequency in hertz does the U.S. electric grid operate? Most folks remembered that it was at 60 hertz. Fun fact, the European electrical grid will run at 50 hertz. So that requires different kind of equipment to care for that. All right, so yeah, so when does the utility know when to use what? Well, utility companies are periodically planning long-term for which of the resources to use. And they have to constantly decide what resources to turn on, maybe wind up, maybe turn off, maybe wind down, so they can balance generation and demand. As you can see, in this graph, it shows at the bottom you see base load, and base load usually matches the minimum amount of electricity being demanded by customers throughout the day, regardless of whether there are spikes in usage or not. It matters to us because base load, we want to, if we know that we're always going to be using a given quantity of kilowatt hours or megawatt hours throughout the day, we want to use a resource that is most, economically efficient to be filling that need. And then peak load is for other resources that can be more responsive. And peak load just has to do with like the spikes and dips in electricity being demanded by customers throughout the day that are beyond what usually is the minimum that is being used. The graph here on the left side will represent how a utility company may decide which of the resources to tap depending on the demand. If you notice, things like combustion turbines are all the way to the top because the cost per megawatt hour would be probably a lot higher. Um, Whereas renewables tend to be a lot cheaper. So the first decision that the utility company has to make is like which resources are most cost effective and can we use them first, clear them out first in order not to overburden uh, ratepayers with too high of a costs. The second thing that needs to be taken into consideration is on the graph on the right, that about 25% of US power plants can start within an hour. That is super cool. But the reality is that for coal power plants, it may take not only hours, but sometimes it might take days to get back to like electric supply and capacity. And so some can be almost instantaneously, like in the case of like gas turbines, but it is not the case with um, with coal, right? That it's not available on an instant. Battery charge is usually available on an instant, but solar and wind might be available, depending on the time of the day and how the weather is looking like. So I asked people during the class, just to take a guess, according to the levelized cost of electricity, to rank the following generation resources from highest being the most affordable to lowest being the most expensive. And this is what people thought would be cost-wise, what it would look like. Uh, Now, for those of you that don't know what a levelized cost of electricity is, well, it just measures, it's a measurement that we use to average the cost of electricity generation over the lifetime of a power generator, which allows for comparison between different sources in terms of their costs. What I did is I showed the minimum average costs related to energy sources relevant to Utah. So these are not numbers specific to Utah. This is just the lowest national averages that the levelized cost of electricity sees. And as you can see, wind onshore, nationally speaking, it's $37 per megawatt hour, right? That's most cost effective, followed by solar, which is not that far behind at $38 per megawatt hour. What you notice is that our greatest source of electricity here is coal, and that's $71 per megawatt hour. Nuclear, which is what you know, our state wants to build more of, it's $141 per megawatt hour. Uh, Notice the difference of how much money it's costing per megawatt hour compared to wind and solar. And then gas peaking being the highest. Gas peaking is the highest usually because it's pretty quick to turn on and turn off and control it. Um, but it's also really resource intensive. Like you have to use fuel, like a like the turbine in a jet, right? Um, and so this gives you an idea of like the kind of decision making that usually utilities have to go through. How do we use the lowest cost resource first? But also, in the case of coal, um, it's really hard to turn on and turn off. So they have to figure out how to combine all the resources at their disposal to provide reliable and also cost-effective electricity. And that leads us a little bit more to talk about covering the costs of operating the grid. And for this side, um, I will say another way of stating like the cost of operating the grid would be revenue requirement. I know at this point, revenue requirement may sound like a big word, but just know it is super important. And you'll hear it a lot at the Public Service Commission. And it determines what it is like a determination of how much money utilities are allowed to collect from ratepayers to cover all of their costs in a given year. So your goal for this section is to determine how electric utilities calculate what they're allowed to charge us. But utilities aren't like other businesses, and they operate under a different set of rules. So let's first talk about how utilities are regulated in the United States. First of all, a public utility is a business that provides an everyday necessity to the public at large. In order to incentivize private investment and operation, public utilities are given a right to be a regulated monopoly. Now, why a monopoly? Well, it's thought that just because monopolies can be the most efficient way to provide a service, by bundling it all, it can save costs. With that said, don't monopolies have a particular flaw that once they become monopolies, then they're allowed to hike up the costs to maximize the profits, right? Well, companies like Rocky Mountain Power aren't just monopolies, but regulated monopolies, meaning that the rates that they charge customers must be approved by our Public Service Commission. And this is usually done through rate cases at the Public Service Commission. In these rate cases, the Public Service Commission must allow the opportunity for a utility like Rocky Mountain Power to earn a fair profit for its investors. The opportunity. The keywords here are allow and fair. Rocky Mountain Power is not guaranteed to profit from their operations. In fact, the Utah Public Service Commission just rejected them this year from hiking up our rates to cover the costs and losses from their negligent operation of the grid in Oregon during the 2021 wildfires in that state. Now, the word I introduced earlier, revenue requirement, comes into play. This is a determination of the total amount of revenue a utility like Rocky Mountain Power will need to cover the cost of operating the grid and make some profit. So it's both cover the cost and give us a chance to also make a marginal level of profit. This is usually what we would call the phase one of a rate case, which is just determining the cost to operate the grid on a year-to-year basis so that the utility can profit. That annual amount is what we call the revenue requirement. Now, next class, we're going to explore the class cost of service study. This is the class that will help you understand your electric bill the most. Class cost of service is the exercise of determining who is charged for what, who's charged what for utilities to provide electricity, so that the utility company can meet its revenue requirement. That splitting of the rates and tariffs for each customer class is usually the second phase of a rate case. So you're probably wondering then, What can utility companies like Rocky Mountain Power charge us? So we'll look into the formula for revenue requirement. Uh, Before then, just to make sure that people really remembered, we asked the question, um, how much money, what is a technical term to describe how much money a utility must earn in rates in order to earn a fair rate of return on a given year? Um, the folks that were able to answer, for the most part, got it right. So now you know. Let's dive into what they can charge for through understanding the revenue requirement formula. And here's a little bit of math, no equations, no numbers. I'm going to try to skip that as much as I can so I don't lose you. So don't be scared, it's just a formula. So we're not doing any math. Revenue requirement, the annual cost of operating the grid, plus profit is made of O plus T plus D plus R times RB. That means operating expenses plus taxes plus depreciation costs plus the rate of return times the rate based. Let's break it down. O stands for operating expenses. And all that means is the day-to-day costs like labor and repairs. Um, I will mention that not all day-to-day costs are allowed to be charged to customers. There's these things called above-the-line expenses that are charges that can be charged to the ratepayer. So this includes just the running of the power plant, right? That's okay for the utility company to charge us. Below-the-line expenses are charges that cannot be charged to the ratepayer. Uh, these include the costs of lobbying or the naming rights to things like stadiums or charitable donations, etc. So I want to be clear about this. The utility company isn't allowed to charge us for infrastructure until it has become operational and it is useful to ratepayers. I will note that it's possible for them to request money early so they can have the capital to build something out, but that's usually an exception and not the rule. The next part is the T, which is just taxes. Usually they're federal, state, and municipal, usually. The D is just depreciation costs. And the depreciation costs really, really matters. Essentially, we pay for things like the power plants, the transmission lines, the distribution lines, uh, once they're built and operational. Say a coal power plant comes online, we don't pay for the whole power plant the moment that it comes online or as they're building it, usually. Usually, the cost of that plant is spread through its lifetime. The Utility and the Public Service Commission can decide whether to charge ratepayers using a straight line depreciation, for example, where it just means that they're just splitting the costs of the total plan evenly throughout the years. They can also choose accelerated depreciation, which means that the utility company can charge more to recoup their costs earlier and charge less for depreciation during its later years. The D matters because let's say that we secured an early retirement of an expensive coal power plant or gas plant, but the plant hasn't fully depreciated. If a plant isn't retired, then it is no longer, if a plant is retired, then at that moment it is no longer operational or useful to the ratepayer. So should the ratepayer be forced to pay off for an asset that isn't providing electricity? What if the utility company decides to build an expensive nuclear power plant in order to meet our electrical needs? They have the right to make those judgment calls for themselves, but they still have to justify that they're doing it at the most cost-effective and prudent way possible. If they do that, to what extent should that privately owned utility company carry the risk for their decisions to gamble by purchasing or building a power generation that is too expensive? This is what the conversation about depreciating costs tends to be about, which takes us then to the rate of return. Unless you've gone to business school, just know that return here just means profit. You can likely always replace return with profit in this context. The rate of return is a percentage that Rocky Mountain Power is allowed to profit from the assets they own that they use to provide services to us, the ratepayers. Now, rate base is the value of the assets the utility company owns that are operational. This includes the power plants, the transmission lines, the distribution lines, etc. So, but again, these are things that they own. Things that they don't own, like they rent or it's being provided by others, that's not part of something that they can profit from. So let's go back to the formula. Oh, and before we go back to the formula, I asked the group, you're the commission now. Would you consider the following operating expenses to be above the line or below the line? And higher the number meant above the line, below the line were like just for lower the number. And for the most part, people caught on that there's very like black and white things like labor costs and maintenance, like I was mentioning. Those are above the line costs, but lobbying and advertising are not. Um, but the question becomes things like wildfire liability and income tax. That's where it gets murky. And those were tricky questions because there's not a black and white. It just depends on what the public service commission at that place will judge to be something that the ratepayer should pay for versus the company. And so just wanted to bring a little bit of the black and whiteness and also the grayness to this discussion because it's definitely there. That's why your comments to the commission matter. But going back to the formula then, revenue requirement was operating expenses, taxes, and depreciation, which are, they're just the general costs of operation. You see the second part of it, that's the total rate of return times the rate base. That's essentially the profit they get to make. That is the profit. Good thing to note here is that, yes, to the depreciation costs, we pay off what it costs to build those assets. But the benefit for the utility, is that they get to own and profit from those assets. So sure, we're helping them pay it off, but they put the money forward and they get to own it. The higher the value of those assets, the more they're allowed to profit from them. And again, it can only be assets they own. So for instance, if Rocky Mountain Power doesn't want to build their own solar farm or wind farms, sorry, let me go back. So if Rocky Mountain Power doesn't want to build their own solar or wind farms, they have the option to buy from something that is called a qualifying facility, which is a separate company, separate from the utility company, that sells electricity that it makes to the utility. The cost of that electricity is an operational cost, but not an asset that they get to profit from. So from today's lesson, why do you think Rocky Mountain Power would want to retire its coal power plants? Why do you think Rocky Mountain Power would be hostile against renewables like solar and wind? Take for a moment the Hunter Power Plant in Emery County, which is pictured here, right? It had an initial end-of-life retirement year of 2042. That's a coal asset that they own that they can profit from while the plant is operational. Also, from their own studies, they have found it is becoming more increasingly uneconomical to operate. It's just expensive to run coal plants, which is why in their 2023 Integrated Resource Plan, Rocky Mountain Power announced that it will retire the Hunter plant by 2032. If the Hunter coal units were to be retired earlier than 2042, it's possible that Rocky Mountain Power may take on some losses. The Public Service Commission at that point can provide, through a rate case, either full, partial, or no cost recovery. Usually the Public Service Commission tend to lean on some kind of partial cost recovery for this kind of situation. But what use is it to Rocky Mountain Power to own a coal plant that is not in usage? Those are years of avoided profit. And that's a massive opportunity cost for their shareholders. What if other companies were to build much more affordable solar and wind farms and sell the cheaper electricity back to Rocky Mountain Power? Well, the utility company can only charge ratepayers what the utility is paying for buying that electricity externally. And the utility can claim a profit from those assets. What if more and more people install rooftop solar at their homes? By the way, the practice where ratepayers can both consume electricity from the utility and also be able to sell electricity from like their solar panels back to the grid is what we call net metering. So in the case of net metering, not only does Rocky Mountain Power not get to profit from the rooftop solar panels because those are not assets they own, but they also face a hypothetical problem known as the utility death spiral. This scenario happens when utilities have massive fixed costs, and more solar panels means that there's less consumption of electricity made by the utility company, which means they have to credit the customer, which means less revenue to cover those fixed costs. This would force the utility company then to raise rates in order to be able to cover its own costs and earn their profit, which in exchange would incentivize more people to get more affordable renewable energy built at their homes, which then again would mean that even less cost recovery and so on. That's the utility debt spiral. And shareholders of this privately owned utility would be the ones that would take the hit for the risk they've taken. But if generating electricity through clean renewable energy would mean massive cost savings for the public, and electricity is a public good, does the public have a responsibility to absorb the risk that was taken by a private corporation, in this case, Rocky Mountain Power? And this is the segue for the next class that I'm going to touch on in a moment, um, which is on August 21st. We will learn how rates are determined, how the costs and burden of running the grid is spread through different customers. What you've learned today about components of the grid is going to help you understand how the costs of generation, transmission, and distribution are split between customers. Also, we will jump into how costs are split depending on like their causes, like demand-related costs, energy-related costs, customer-related costs. And lastly, we're going to learn how to identify those costs in our utility bills and why how that gets split matters. All of this will help us prepare for sharing our public comments at the Utah Public Service Commission on Wednesday, October 29. So we asked everyone one word that comes to mind as we close today's session. And you can see brain explode, complicated, informative, overwhelmed. It's a, I mean, the grid is a big invention and it's complicated. And the fact is that by the time that you've ended this class, you probably know more than, 95% of the population about our electrical grid and about how costs get determined. So there was also in person, we had a lot of excitement for what's coming up next. And so, yeah, we wanted to take a moment to ask everyone if you were following this presentation, this QR code should also work for you. So you can fill out the survey. It can take you anywhere from 20 seconds to maybe a couple minutes, and it does help us, the curriculum team, ensure the quality of this offering. This is our first time doing something like this, so your feedback would be extremely welcomed, particularly if you were online watching this presentation. And before I close, I just want to make sure to thank everyone for participating in this, and particularly to our amazing curriculum team from Utah Needs Clean Energy and the Sierra Club, which is composed of Alyssa, Emma, Maya, Stan, Joan, Chris, Natalie, and yours truly. So thank you, everybody, for being a part of this. And we will see you on Thursday, August 21st, for Who Pays for What and Why. Okay, thank you.